Hi everyone, so in today's video, I'm going to be discussing 5 bad habits that all writers should stop doing. Check out my description for my disclaimer on craft videos, but for now, let's jump right in. So the first bad habit is rereading your work with a negative mindset or when you're rushing. There's something really crushing about rereading your work and intensely hating everything you wrote. I've been there so many times where I feel like what I've written doesn't hold up to the quality of what I usually write. However, most of the time, in my experience, I end up really hating something I wrote because I rushed through the process or I went into the reading process with a negative mindset. Oftentimes when I reread something I wrote, I have an expectation or hope that it will be good. But if I'm really anxious or worried that what I wrote, let's say the day before, really isn't good, sometimes I'll find myself rushing the piece or prejudging it without really even knowing. So this means I might be going into rereading a work with bad intentions. Basically, like I'm hunting for a mistake, and I'm not even trying to do it on purpose. I'm not even lying, this is not an exaggeration, but every single time I've gone into rereading my work with this mindset, I've come out hating the work. I then go on to completely discount the work's merit and 100% decide that it must be garbage. So why shouldn't you do this? Why shouldn't you rush through your work or go into rereading your work with a negative mindset? Sometimes when I prejudge work as bad, I end up making drastic changes that I didn't need to make. So often I found myself writing a short story or a chapter or a scene, and I decide that it must be bad, and I end up deleting giant parts of it and never looking back at them. I might even take the book in a completely different direction because of my prejudged opinion. Or my perspective in the moment of rereading the work makes me feel bad about the entire project, even if it's just a small section. In my experience, you can end up expending a lot more effort based off of an opinion that was fueled by negativity. So before you say anything like, Rachel, are you saying that we should just ignore criticism? That is not at all what I'm trying to say. If you do have negative self-criticism, that's okay. That's part of being an editor. But I'm more saying to be aware of the energy you're bringing to rereading the work. So often, I've gone back to work that I deemed as bad weeks later, reread it, and realized it wasn't bad in the first place. I was just not in the right mindset when I was rereading it. So what habits should you develop instead? I suggest developing a habit of gentleness with your work. A lot of writers, and I've been here too, like to tear apart their work because they fear that other people will do it and they want to do it before anyone else can say something. That sort of mindset, the preliminary destruction of one's own work, isn't necessarily productive. If you find yourself prejudging your work, perhaps take some time to decompress. Or you can even reread the work at a later time. But if I don't have time to just come back at a later date because I'm a busy person, and I'm sure many of you watching this are also very busy, I also recommend perhaps just making a note for yourself that you were maybe not in the best mood or in the best mindset when you were rereading your work. I also personally like to let my rest work for a day or two for this exact reason before I reread it. And that's because distance helps with the objectivity, at least in my process. Sometimes I also try going into the work with an actively positive mindset. As a pessimist, this is hard to do, but I do that because if I do notice I don't like something, it doesn't feel like crushing disappointment. So the next bad habits that all writers need to stop doing is thesaurus writing. So I'm calling myself out on this one, but who here has personally been victimized by their incessant need to find a synonym for every single word they write in their book? Don't get me wrong, thesauruses are fabulous tools that writers should use. This is not me recommending that you completely take thesauruses out of your writing routine. I'm more talking to the folks like me, I used to do this a lot, who would look for synonyms for every single word in every single sentence. Yes, I used to do that. I used to do this at the time because I honestly didn't trust myself to pick the best word for the sentence or for the paragraph. The problem was that this slowed down my process so much, and I felt really trapped writing like this. But at the same time, I didn't know what other processes would work for me, so I just continued to write like this. I was using the thesaurus to mask my insecurity with my writing. If the thesaurus gave me a more specific or gorgeous adjective, then I didn't have to feel so bad about my writing. However, I think I wasted a lot of time thesaurus writing when I could have been using that time developing my style and learning to trust myself as an editor. The thesaurus will always be there for you. You can always use it later. But if you're like me and you find that you're trying to perfect your work as you go and it's not the kind of process that you like, but you don't know what else to do, what habits habits should you develop instead? So what I like to do is only really use the thesaurus when I'm revising. But if you're somebody who does like to use the thesaurus while you're writing, perhaps limit yourself to swapping out 1 or 2 words in a sentence if you're somebody who's looking for synonyms for every single word like I was. Or perhaps use the thesaurus after every paragraph or every scene. For me, it was most productive to actually cut the thesaurus out of my drafting routine altogether. I really only use a thesaurus now if I feel like my brain isn't like in thinking mode and I really need some ideas on words to use. So what I do now is I like to bold words that I'm not happy with or that I want to swap out later. Though most of the time when I reread the work, I don't end up changing those bolded words because I realize they were fine all along. Not every single word in every single sentence needs to be profound or poetic in order for it to make an impact. So in those moments, I realized I was being too harsh when I was drafting, which connects back to point 1. So the third bad habit that all writers should stop doing is suppressing their instinctual process. So raise your hand if you're a pantser who thought you had to outline in order to write a good book or vice versa. When I first started writing, I truly felt that I had to work against my natural creative inclinations and my natural writing process because it just wasn't correct and would never lead to a good book or a good story. I thought I just had to do what everyone else was doing. And this is not necessarily just pantser versus outliner. It can be write every day, not write every day. It can apply to anything in your process. At one point, I was forcing myself to plan books because I thought that this was the only way to write a good manuscript. In the process, I wasted a ton of time writing outlines that never turned into books because I never ended up writing them. That was just not my process. I wish I had spent more time actually writing those projects instead of forcing myself to follow a process that just isn't intuitive to me. I even knew this at the time, but I still convinced myself that the only way to be a quality writer was to outline. And again, this is not supposed to be a pantsing or outlining debate. What I'm saying in this tip is to use the process that works best for you. Suppressing your instinctual writing process may do more harm than it does good. A really important part of becoming a good writer is understanding what works best for you. A lot of writers, especially new writers, miss out on this because they're doing what other people told them to do, and they may not have necessarily done some self-exploration into what they like to do. So what habits should you develop instead? I'd get comfortable finding the process that works for you, and I know I've said that a dozen times in this tip, but it's so important. In my opinion, this takes a lot of trial and error, so it's not necessarily something that's going to come overnight, but it's something you have to experiment with. I personally also like to follow my instincts. If my instinct is to write a book right now, I do that instead of doing the polar opposite because I've learned that my instincts are really integral to my writing process. But if you feel like your instincts are not integral to your writing process, then don't follow them. Follow what works best for you. Writing overall should be enjoyable. Sometimes there's going to be difficult parts, but as a whole, it should not be torture. I don't know why I didn't think that was true when I was younger. I thought you had to suffer in order to be a writer. I thought you had to sacrifice your joy and what you wanted to do in order to be good. But honestly, as I've developed, I've learned that the more I engage the process that I enjoy, the better of a writer I become. And that's because I developed my own writerly routine by doing that. So the next bad habit that writers should stop doing is getting too much critique on a piece. For those of us who are in writing workshops, this is not meant as a call out to writing workshops, but it is more a tale of caution, I think. I think that getting too much critique on a piece can be a mistake. And that's not necessarily going to be true for every single project. And as I say in the description in my disclaimer, you gotta do what works best for you. But in my experience, I found that too much critique can be just as damaging as no critique at all. So let's say you have a cupcake. Usually you're gonna want frosting with the cupcake, but you're not necessarily gonna want to eat a bucket of frosting with a dash of cupcake on top. Maybe some of you might want to. Having too much critique can be like having too much frosting. While you have a lot of something you consider good, that doesn't necessarily mean that that good thing is useful or desirable. You ordered a cupcake. You didn't order a bucket of frosting with a cupcake on the side. When I entered my degree, and I'm a creative writing student for those of you who don't know, I thought the more critique I get, the better. And now that I'm almost finished my undergrad, I realize that that's just not true. More critique does not necessarily mean that you'll have a better understanding of how to revise. In fact, and this might be controversial, I think that too much critique can cloud your judgment with the voices of other people. And I strongly believe that a writer's judgment is one of their most important tools. I think it's good to have however many voices in your corner that you can manage. With so much feedback, it might be difficult to sort it to your relevant intention. Writing is not 2 + 2, it's not math. There is no finite answer. Rules of writing were created with certain biases in place. I found that was really hard to understand when I initially was getting a ton of feedback feedback on my work, because as writers, I think we're taught that taking tons of criticism is part of the job. And while that may be true in some instances, I don't necessarily agree with it, but it might be true in some instances, I don't think you have to apply all of the criticism you get. Also, practically speaking, how are you realistically supposed to implement the drastically different or contradictory feedback of 20 or 30 different people? If that's helpful for you, go for it. In my experience, I find it really difficult. So what habits should you develop instead? Well, I like to get my work critiqued by a handful, so not a bucket full of people. And those are always going to be people I trust. In my opinion, it's more helpful to get critique from a handful of people versus a bucket load of people, because a bucket load can kind of drown out your vision, where a handful might help you enhance it. So once you receive the critique, try to analyze it in the context of what you want for your story. Sometimes you want changes after reading your critique, and that's okay. The critique helped you understand your story better. But at the end of the day, people are critiquing you to make your writing better, so your intent should be prioritized. This is not to say that you should not get critique on your work. As a writing major, I know that critique is a critical part of improving as a writer. But if I could give advice to my younger self, it would be, don't automatically assume that the more critique you get, the better your work will be. The only person who makes your writing better is you. Other people may critique your work, but you're the one implementing that critique. So choose the feedback that resonates with you. So the final bad habit that writers should stop doing is abandoning your story too early. So who else has gotten so nervous or afraid to continue a story, or maybe it got hard, that you then shelve it and then move on to something else, and the cycle kind of keeps happening? Well, I've been there. Of the bad habits, this is the one that I want to disclaim the most, because I don't think that it's a bad thing to stop writing stories that aren't bringing you joy anymore or that are causing you distress. This is more in regards to people who want to finish their story but haven't been able to for whatever reason. So I think that learning how to finish a story is one of the best things a writer can do to improve, because it teaches you how to close an arc. I also think that it may help you better see what you wrote, because the end might contextualize the beginning. The problem with writing is that finishing a story isn't always easy. Most of the time it's very difficult. And when it becomes difficult, I found myself in a position where I just give up. Sometimes though, you may miss out on what a story could be if you decide up front that it isn't working. So if you do want to continue your story, perhaps you need to change the point of view character, or the actual point of view, or something else. Or perhaps you started in the wrong place. Getting to the end may illuminate those problems. But if you don't get to the end, you may not know. And I think that was an issue I had when I first started writing. I'd get so many ideas and I'd be excited about all of them, but I'd eventually get into a rut and sort of abandon the piece. And it wasn't my intent. I didn't want to abandon it. I wanted to finish the work, but I never did. And so what can you do if you're in that same position? What habits should you develop instead? Before you stop writing a project, can you see if you can finish any part of it, if it's just like the next sentence or the next paragraph or the next page or the next scene or the next chapter? For me, instead of thinking of a book as, oh my God, it's this giant thing, because that's very overwhelming to think of. No wonder it's difficult to get to the end. I kind of like to think of it in bite-sized pieces. So what do I need to get to the next beat? What do I need to get to the end of the next paragraph, or the end of the next page, or the end of the next chapter, or the end of the next part of this book? I find that those bite-sized pieces make the process way less daunting. Also, I think it's really important to note that endings don't have to be perfect. I often feel pressure to write a perfect conclusion on the first go, because ending seems so important to a story. It's where all the loose ends are wrapped up. It's where a theme can be made more apparent. But learning to let go of that perfection has been really important in creating sustainability in my writing process. And it might just help you get to the end. I also like to think of it as not necessarily, oh, this is the end of the book, or I'm trying to write the end, or I'm trying to get to the end, but I'm trying to find a place to call it done. Because with an art form, it's not gonna go ding, 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 like you're done. You have to decide that. Is there a moment where you can call the project done instead of finished or ended? So those are 5 habits that writers should stop doing. I really came up with this video based off of personal experience and a lot of my bad habits. And the solutions that I've given in this video are things that I've implemented and that I find helpful, and I hope that they're helpful for you. Let me know what your bad habit in writing is, because this video is just 5 of mine. Let's chat in the comments, but for now, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in another one. Bye.